What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 4 of season 2 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. Today's episode is about non-Western democracy. I'd like to thank David Schecter for bringing this area of democratic thinking and practice to my attention and for introducing me to my two guests, Associate Professor Benjamin Isakhan and PhD scholar Zelalem Sirna from Ethiopia. Benjamin is an Associate Professor of Politics and Policy Studies and the founding director of POLIS, a research network for politics and international relations at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization at Deakin University in Australia. He is also an Adjunct Senior Research Associate in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, and an Associate of the Sydney Democracy Network at the University of Sydney. Ben is the author of Democracy in Iraq, History, Politics, Discourse, and editor of 6 books, including The Secret History of Democracy, which has been translated into Japanese and Arabic, and the Edinburgh Companion to the History of Democracy, From Prehistory to Future Possibilities. He is a leading expert and regular commentator on Middle Eastern politics, democracy and democratization across the Middle East, and heritage destruction in the Middle East. Thanks for joining me today, Ben. What would you identify as the key components of democracy?
I guess front and centre I always try to point out that I'm not really a big fan of the idea that we should arrive at one standard definition of democracy. People have been kind of fumbling and making haphazard attempts at coming to one agreed upon definition for decades now, and we still haven't made much progress. And I think there's a couple of problems with that. The first one is that it contradicts the democratic ethos if we all agree, because the whole point is to disagree. So in a sense, debates around the idea of what democracy is are a microcosm of what democracy is. It's supposed to be a whole bunch of disagreements, and it's in the aggregate of disagreement that we get the democratic spirit, rather than forced consensus to an arbitrary definition. I also think that even if we did, and we're never going to, but even if we did decide here and now on a definition and the whole world agreed on it, I'm not sure how useful it would be for future generations. So if the ancient Greeks had come up with an agreed upon definition 2,500 years ago of what democracy is, what use would it be for us today? And similarly, if the Paris Commune had come up with a definition a couple hundred years ago, what use would it be today? It wouldn't be very useful. Democracy is all about responding to the varying needs of people over time, and that's what a democracy should do. And those needs change, they evolve. Human civilization changes by virtue of its existence. And so we ought to always resist the very strong temptation to come to these kind of standardized definitions or ways of measuring and controlling what democracy is and comparing one to another according to all of these very rigid, at times heavily quantified systems, because if we get stuck in that trap, we really lose sight of the fact that, well, people in one society might feel that they live in a very responsive, dynamic, democratic society, even if all of the indices that we've come to rely on indicate that they don't. So, I think that is kind of a bit of a problem for the discipline and a challenge for the discipline. However, having said all of that massive caveat about what my reservations about how one ought to define or set or identify, as you put it, the key components of a democracy, there are some things that I think broadly have consensus. And in the introduction to the Edinburgh Companion to the History of Democracy that Steve Stockwell and I published a couple of years ago, I tried to articulate what I thought then is a kind of, if you like, working definition or working model we can use to apply historically and to apply to contemporary examples to gauge the extent to which we might think democracy is going on in those contexts. So in that, what I articulate is that I think that democracy really has 3 elements to it. and that any claim to democracy ought to be able to measure up according to these three fundamental elements. The first one really is democracy must have citizens to the full extent of what that might mean. In other words, a population that are imbued with certain rights, for example, the right to determine who governs them, and at the same time certain responsibilities, such as the responsibility to participate in the process of determining who governs them. So citizenship, I think, is central. The full extent of what citizenship means or ought to mean is central to any claim to democracy. The second one is that there ought to be laws, or in a less structured social environment or political environment, there ought to be norms that protect their rights and responsibilities. In other words, that protect their citizenship, the idea that they are full citizens to the full extent of what that means. And today, what we typically refer to that as being, for example, the Constitution. The Constitution is a document that outlines the protection of citizenship. But it doesn't have to be so formal. It can just be social norms that citizens are protected and their rights and responsibilities are protected. And the third part to it is kind of three parts unto itself. Any claim to democracy, I think, needs to have equal parts of three further things. It needs to have equal parts of contestation, cooperation, and participation. So we need people to compete for power. The opposition parties is the way in which we think of it today. There needs to be opposition to government. There needs to be credible contestation of power. There needs to be cooperation. So all the contest in the world is one thing, but if people don't, at the end of for example, the electoral cycle, if people don't get on with cooperating, then democracy very quickly falls apart. And there also needs to be participation. Any claim to democracy is empty. So the Athenian claim to be a democracy would be an empty claim if no one ever turned up to their assemblies. So without people participating, you don't really have any claim to a democracy. So notwithstanding all of my reservations about coming to a definition of what democracy is, I think that it's reasonable to assert that any claim to be a democracy would have these three things: citizenship, laws or norms that protect that citizenship, and equal parts of contestation, cooperation, and participation.
How do those components fit or relate to the current dominant model, which is representative democracy? I mean, you talked about contestation. Does that mean that you accept the representative nature of most current democracies?
Well, it's not whether I accept them or not. They're an empirical fact that most democracies now are representative by nature. And in trying to, and this points to some of my reservations about coming up with a definition, but in trying to articulate what I thought democracies have in common over time, I wanted to capture both pre-representative and representative and arguably post-representative models of what democracy might look like. So if we contain any definition of democracy purely according to its representative function, then we miss the fact that many democracies prior to the representative model were more participatory and therefore weren't built on the same norms and the same premise. So I think the way that I tried to articulate it in that introduction to the volume is precisely that, to capture the fact that democracy has looked so different in so many different circumstances, but what can we find in common between them, representative of or not, what do they have? And they do all tend to have these things: citizenship, laws or norms that protect citizenship, and then equal parts of contestation, cooperation and participation. That's certainly true of every credible claim to representative democracy, as it is to any participatory model or assembly model that I'm aware of.
Okay, thanks for that. And many academics and commentators and even everyday people think of ancient Greece, in particular Athens, as the home of democracy. And I know that you don't necessarily accept this. Can you explain why?
Well, we just spoke then about trying to capture the spirit of democracy in terms of what I articulated to be three fundamental things that seem to be true of all democracies that we know of over time. I guess my point of contention then was that in fact, it really doesn't matter to me which definition you accept. So anyone out there listening now can come up more or less with any agreeable definition to what democracy is. And certainly you can review all of the different definitions that have occurred up until today. And if you apply that definition, whatever one you decide on, to the entire history of human civilization, it is simply inconceivable that it has only occurred within Western contexts. It's inconceivable. And it is also similarly, absolutely, I reject the idea that the Greeks were the first to have ever done anything that would meet that definition. The Greeks were not the first to have done many, many, many different things. The fact that they coined the term democracy doesn't mean that they were the first to practice it and to abide by its spirit. Communities have been doing deliberative and participatory and inclusive forms of governance from the very earliest moments of human civilization. There's evidence right back to very primitive social structures. And those communities would not have survived, and arguably the human species would not have survived up until today if we didn't do things collectively and collaboratively. And that therein is the very spirit of what we're talking about, of the democratic ethos. And I think that there was an enormous intellectual effort, particularly in the 18th, 19th century, as democracy was being reborn on the continent, to try and find historical legitimacy and connect the very different practices of the Greeks and Romans, for example, to the contemporary practices of Europeans. And implicit in that was a kind of Eurocentric idea that, well, democracy is somehow a kind of an idea of Western civilization, and that when Western civilization is at its best, it's at its most democratic. But that was a really very haphazard and unscientific process that they went through, and also largely driven by very Eurocentric, and we can even state it in much harsher terms than that, very racist ideas about non-Western civilizations that were proliferated at the time. And of course, there are all kinds of critiques of that. Edward Said's Orientalism. Martin Burnell talks a lot about the Aryan model of historiography that was developed during this time, where the assumption really was that Western civilization had been driving the democratic spirit from its very beginning. It's a very arbitrary process. And yes, I think anyone who just wants to think about that for a moment. I mean, if you think about it in another way, philosophy, it's a Greek word, but no one would ever rightly make the claim that the Greeks were the first to have profound ideas about human existence. It's absurd. People have been thinking profoundly about human existence since the dawn of time. And they were thinking about it in all different contexts and in all different ways. They were philosophizing well before the Greeks came up with the word, and civilizations after it, and right up until today that lie well outside the Western canon, if you like, have been philosophizing. It makes no sense. No one would ever rightly accept that only the Greeks ever philosophized, and that the Greeks were first to philosophize, and that it's only ever happened in the Western world. Well, it's happened everywhere because it's a human inclination to think about the nature of human existence. And I would say the same about democracy. Democracy is a human inclination. We are at our best when we work together. It provides the ability for stability, the ability to gather resources, the ability to work together as a community towards the common good. It's a mechanism to do that. And it just seems ridiculous to me that anyone could credibly think that only one group of people had ever come to that conclusion. So yeah, I reject the idea that the Greeks were the first and the West is the only home of legitimate democratic governance. It's not something I reject because I don't like it. I reject it because the evidence is overwhelmingly convincing that it's not true. You can now go, and there's a whole heap of evidence now about ancient Mesopotamian assemblies, for example, things very similar to Athens going on in ancient India, in China, amongst the Phoenicians, a whole heap of different civilizations that occurred contemporaneously or prior to the Athenian experiment that practiced things remarkably similar to what the Greeks were doing. And there's also a lot of evidence that democracy didn't die at the end of the Roman Republic, that it was going on in all corners of the world, in all different parts of the world, in that period in which we typically imagine that it was wiped off the face of the earth between the end of the Roman Republic and the start of things like the Magna Carta and the rebirth of European democratic experiments.
And you refer to democratic governance and not necessarily democratic government. Is that an actual difference conceptually? I've heard people say that I've heard critiques of non-Western approaches to democracy around the fact that they don't really address power. They're actually they're more about consultation. And I just wonder, is there anything there in your use of the word governance?
Of course, yeah. So the difference, the technical definition of difference between the two is that one is about a formalized institutional arrangement that governs, this is government, that governs in a particular context for the people, if you like, whether they like it or not. And in some cases they like it because it's a democratic government and they have elected that government to work on their behalf. In other cases they don't like that government or they haven't chosen it and it's an autocratic government, for example, or a dictatorship or whatever. Governance is about interaction, engagement, an ongoing process of engaging and doing. So many of the examples of where, and this includes examples that are held up as good examples of democratic history, for example, ancient Greece, is not only about government, it's also about governance. It's also about dealing with day-to-day issues. It's not just about electing those who serve in power. It's about a continual process of the issues of the day. And so I use the word governance not because I think some of the examples we're talking about that fall outside the Western canon weren't also part of government in the sense that they were the institutions that governed, but also because it's a broader word that implies that it's an ongoing relationship that concerns both government and the process of negotiation around the issues of the day.
My next question relates to the various approaches that are around today to assess the quality of democracy. Many, and you've sort of touched on, some of this in your earlier answers, but many of them are used internationally to determine whether a country is democratic or not. Often they're linked to funding or other privileges in the sort of, international community. And I just wonder what your thoughts are about that, particularly in the context of non-Western forms of democracy and whether they can ever meet the standards set empirically by Western countries and authorities and so on. And I mean, I guess whether, that's a useful way of approaching it.
Well, I think it's a very good question. I think there's no simple, straightforward answer to that kind of question. On the one hand, I applaud the work that's being done in that space. I think that we do need empirical measures to compare and contrast, and they're useful to an extent. I mean, it is interesting to see how much press freedom there is in Ghana as opposed to in Mongolia, or it is interesting to know whether elections are deemed free and fair in Tunisia as opposed to in, wherever else. And the extent to which a state measure or a system of government measures up to all of those different empirical metrics is important. I think that we ought to have that data. It's not bad data in and of itself. It's a good way of comparing and contrasting. I guess it is kind of there are reasons that it's problematic as well. Firstly, it's clearly Eurocentric in the sense that it's developed and then imposed upon other cultures and civilizations and ways of doing government and governance without any understanding of what might be a more nuanced experience for people on the ground. Just simply that you don't have press freedom doesn't necessarily imply, or you don't have as much press freedom as the next state, doesn't implicitly, the conclusion I draw from that isn't implicitly that therefore it is less democratic on a day-to-day level for the people living in the state. People might feel that press freedom isn't, it is important and I defend press freedom, but people in that given context may not feel that it's as important. So that could be one way of negating that. I think that beyond it kind of being a little bit Eurocentric in that broad sense, I think that it is also reductive. So it reduces, and this is true of all quantitative data, and very good any good quantitative analyst worth his salt will tell you that by nature of quantitative material, you're being reductive. It's what you do. But we haven't yet integrated a broader sense of what democracy feels like and a way of measuring that and quantifying it that would give us a more nuanced picture of how democracy is done in different contexts, and then being able to compare and contrast that as opposed to just whether elections are held or just whether the press is free. We need a richer ethnographic way of understanding how people feel about their democracy and whether or not it works for them. But yeah, I mean, I'm not against it in principle. I think that the work needs to be done. But of course, there's always more work that needs to be done, and we could definitely have a richer way of analysing that.
I think some people would say we've got too many indexes already, but yes, I certainly take your point about,
Sure.
they all tend to be very quantitative, one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, if you were able to do a qualitative parallel to those quantitative measures, or an ethnographic parallel, or both, it's just like any study, right? Anything that you do, if you can get a body of data that is dry, quantitative, empirical material, and you can couple that with rich ethnographic and or qualitative material, then you'll get a much more nuanced picture of the phenomena, whatever that phenomena is. People's experience of sending their children to daycare, right? You could get some kind of quantitative measure of that, and that's interesting. It might tell you trends over time. It might tell you numbers are up or numbers are down, and it might be able to compare one daycare to another. But if you interviewed the parents dropping their kids off at daycare, for example, and you're also to do broader ethnographic observational research of it, then you might find that actually, even though the numbers are going down at this daycare and not at that daycare, the qualitative experience of people dropping their children off at that daycare is actually richer and better, and that reveals much more than the numbers. And that's exactly true of how I would think about democracy. That, so one state is ranked as having higher press freedom than another, or lower press freedom than another, but the extent to which that reveals the broader spirit of democracy, I think, is minimal.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? One of the reasons I started my PhD was in response to the various movements around the world, such as the Arab Spring, the Indignados in Spain, and Occupy Wall Street in the US. Based on your work looking at democracy in the Middle East, what do you see has been the longer-term outcomes, and what are the prospects arising from the Arab Spring?
Well, look, it's a very, very, very complicated question and set of circumstances. The short answer to your question is that it's been a disaster. There is very few exceptions to the idea that the Arab Spring has been, in every measurable sense, an abject failure. Overwhelmingly, the states that participated in the Arab Spring, let's set aside Tunisia, where the Arab Spring began, but if we were to talk about Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and Syria, where the largest protests and the largest sort of momentum gathered behind the Arab Spring, and in every one of them except for Syria, where the dictator is just clinging on to power, the incumbent was toppled. You have a sequence of events over a relatively short amount of time in which all of those states have descended into a situation where most of them are worse off. Certainly Libya, Yemen and Syria, much worse off than they were before. Egypt, depends on who you ask as to the extent to which they're worse off. I would say that you kind of have a situation that is balancing itself out to being not at all dissimilar to the situation they were in before. So in other words, it's achieved very little in terms of progressing democratic freedoms. But the question is then, why? What's the explanation for that? Why would these states in particular have, given the democratic impetus, given the spirit of these revolutions and the mass movements and the enormous sacrifices that people made to come out into the streets and to do everything they did over an extended period of time to oust these dictatorships, why are we looking at such a terrible situation only a handful of years later? The tempting answer is to retreat back into very old rhetoric that in fact it itself goes back to ancient Greece about the ineptitude or the lack of capacity of non-Western people to practice and understand and function within democratic states. The set of discourses around this are, in fact, as I said, very old, and they essentially, something like the Arab Spring in many quarters is seen as justification for the idea that only the West really understands how to do democratic governance, and that other parts of the world are trapped in a web of authoritarian dictatorship, or versus the other side of the coin, which is descending into horrible conflict and sectarian battles and genocide and so on and so on. In other words, in the absence of dictatorship, these people can't govern themselves, and that's a repeated trope that has been wheeled out over the centuries, but particularly since the failures of the Arab Spring. But it's so much more of a story than that. And in fact, that that lens of looking at the post-Arab Spring environment really is deeply problematic, and it discounts in very clear terms the nature of the state that was the post-colonial Arab state. So in Libya, Syria, and Egypt, for example, you have these post-colonial dictatorships that emerge in roughly the middle of the 20th century on the idea that if the Arab world can overthrow the European influence, that they'll be able to build an entirely new state built on sort of secular democratic, well, loosely democratic, secular / socialist ideals. And what happened was that these dictatorships completely failed to build the state that they promised to build. And what you have over decades is a mounting crisis in this ever-widening gap between state and society. So, there's a body of literature, which I don't have time to go into now, about state-society relations in political science, and about the idea that, governance works best when the state and society broadly have this kind of contract, social contract, about how they ought to be governed, and the society buy into that process and so on. And what you have in the Arab states is this enormous and ever-widening gap between state and society. So what you have by the time of the revolution is a completely hollow state. And at the same time, you have a completely fragmented society, a society in which people have very little invested, particularly in places like Syria, in the idea that we all ought to be working together. The same happened in Iraq after 2003 when Saddam was toppled, because the state has not adequately managed the process of bringing this complex, multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious state together. And so as that gap grows, when you topple this hollowed out function of a state, this state that doesn't exist really, what you get is a retreat into parochial identities, into local identities, whether they be tribal, religious, sectarian, or even just localized, because it's easier to work with your local environment than it is to buy into the idea that we should all participate in the broader state. And so that goes some way to answering your question about the reasons or the fundamental premise behind some of the things that have unfolded in the wake of the Arab Spring. The longer term outcomes, I think, really at this point are pretty dire. We're certainly not, I don't think we're going, I would imagine that in most of those cases, things are going to get worse before they get better. The exception to all of that is Tunisia, where things, if you look at what Ennahda have been doing, if you look at what the various political parties and civil society organisations have been doing for the last really 7 years, you really see a remarkable momentum towards building an entirely new democratic state. But that's the exception, unfortunately.
And do you have any sense of why Tunisia is the exception? Like, what is it in the nature of that country that has allowed them to progress where the others have either gone backwards or stayed still?
Good question. Precisely what we were just talking about. So there are two fundamental variables. One is that the Ben Ali regime was a horrible regime, and we should never forget that. But it didn't go as far towards quashing non-state actors as Gaddafi did, as Mubarak did, as Saleh did in Yemen, as Assad did in Syria, so that there was a civil society. And so as the gap grew, I mean, you can go back and read about the various unions, women's movements, intellectual and civil organizations, various protest movements and so on, civil society organizations that existed under the Ben Ali regime. And as the gap between state and society didn't grow as large as it did in the other states, and in that gap, the state permitted civil society to fill the gap. And in Libya, you didn't have that. The gap was, for example, just as one of many examples, in Libya, you had a massive gap between state and society, but the Gaddafi regime allowed no one to fill that gap, not even religious institutions. They were largely co-opted and monitored by the state, as they were in Iraq, as they were in Syria, as they were in many dictatorships all over the world. So in Tunisia, you have a smaller gap, and the gap is filled by various civil society organizations, including religious movements, but a whole panoply of different groups. So as the state crumbles, as the state is toppled, there are existing organizations, mechanisms, unions, political parties, women's groups, and so on, who are able to fill the vacuum. And so people don't have to resort to the kinds of violence and parochial identities that you've seen in the other states.
Thanks. What you're saying is those civil society organisations, not only did they exist, but they were independent of government.
Largely. Of course, the state tried to co-opt them and so on, but Tunisia is a very different state to the other ones. It didn't have the kind of massive oil wealth, for example, that Libya had. So the state was never able to be the kind of all-pervasive Leviathan, to use Hobbes's term. It had limited resources, it had limited capacity, and it just didn't go to the same extent. It did, but it didn't go to the same extent that other states did to quash civil society and opposition movements and so on and so on. So that there were groups there. Those groups had a whole different set of ideologies and ideas about how Tunisia ought to be governed after the fall of Ben Ali. And they're still negotiating this. But the difference is that they're negotiating it collectively, that they realise that it's in all of their best interests to work together. And they were able to fill the gap very quickly as the state collapsed. So there were services provided for local communities. There were existing infrastructures for consultation, for deliberation, for providing basic services, for example, to women, or there were various functions of the state were filled in fairly quickly after the collapse of the state by different organisations. So something like a medical union, would be able to continue to open hospitals when the state collapsed. So that provides a sort of quasi-state in the absence of a functioning state, while the democratic processes allow time to go on. In other states, like Libya, where there was an attempt to build a new sort of democracy and write a constitution and all that, the problem was that there was no one there to fill the gap while they did all that. So there was no hospital, there was no school, because there was no teachers union, there was no medical union, there was no one could run any of these things because it had been all controlled by the state. And it was all controlled, centralised, all highly centralised. So when the state collapsed, everything collapsed.
That's fascinating. Thanks so much for that. Finally, what are the challenges facing democracy now?
I do think probably one of the key ones is really just that the brand of democracy is not doing very well. And this is a whole heap of different things are converging in the early 21st century. One of them is the Bush administration and their interventions built atop the idea of bringing democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan. That created a great deal of cynicism globally about democracy, bringing democracy by war, and then the fact that it was an abject failure in both contexts, and that both states remain terribly behind on any significant index. I think that was the sort of first step in the early 21st century that really began the process of a deep cynicism globally about democracy and its ability to do good governance. And that cynicism is getting way worse. It's gotten out of control now. People are very frank about being dismissive of democracy as a form of government. I mean, you have many other things I can point to. Think of things like the Arab Spring. It's great for Saudi Arabia as just one example. Saudi Arabia can look back at the Arab Spring and say, say to their citizens, don't ask us for democracy, otherwise we'll end up like Libya or Syria. The brand of democracy has lost a lot of its shine, because it's not just lost its shine, but we're now at a point where horrible autocratic, oppressive regimes are able to say to their people, democracy is bad. Look what calls for democracy have achieved in Syria and Libya and so on. Look what it achieved when they went into Iraq. Look what it's achieved here and there and there. And then you put on top of that things like Brexit and Trump, the most recent developments in kind of proliferating a broader cynicism about democracy. And, people are extremely critical and cynical about it now, and with good reason. These two things, 2016 will go down historically as a pretty rough year for democracy, and the extent to which democracy, the brand of democracy globally, is going to suffer as a product of that, I think, is enormous. We'll be feeling the ramifications for years. Just something like Trump, it's a great example. China has been very forthright. Don't ask us for democracy, because this is what happens. You get demagogues who use populist rhetoric to manipulate and lie to people in order to get power. And that's what's happened. And so it's a credible story. But China is able to use it in order to maintain a one-party quasi-authoritarian state. So, the brand, I think, is in real trouble. And it's even in trouble in Western democracies. It's certainly in trouble here. People are deeply cynical about democracy in Australia, probably not on even a fraction of the scale as they are in Europe, in the UK, in the US, and elsewhere. There's a trend now towards strong leadership. And I think in certain quarters, people like Trump and Putin are being applauded for their anti-democratic ideals. So I think the brand's in real trouble. I think that really matters to me.
Zelalem Sirna is a PhD scholar at the Coimbra University in Portugal in the program of Democracy in the 21st Century. He earned his law degree from the Harama University in Ethiopia and his Masters of Philosophy in Indigenous Studies from the University of Tromsø in Norway. For his Masters, he undertook a comparative study of Garda, the traditional system of governance in Ethiopia, and liberal democracy. For his PhD, he is looking at deliberative democracy, deliberative systems, and the Garda system. As a sociology legal researcher, his work mainly focuses on normative pluralism and the challenges it poses in the 21st century. Thanks so much for joining me, Zelalem. Just to start off, what would you identify as the key components of democracy?
Yeah, this is really a more difficult question to answer, but there are some conventional way of identifying this and that are main elements or building blocks of democracy. But before answering this question directly, I would like to really go further. What is really democracy mean? And from that, we can really have a kind of glimpse, if not really an answer to this critical question. I see that democracy from the narration that we have to date, and basically it is Eurocentric, and which emerges from that of Greek, and then came to our present context, and then the center is mainly said to be people. Why we call it democracy? Because we emphasize that this is a rule by the people, for the people, and it is from the people. This kind of context is basically understood in democracy. But I see that from other perspective that there is a public good in democracy, and which others also emphasize that there are three public goods, and one is legitimacy, the other is the economic aspect, which is welfare, and the third one is the collective identity. And which I feel and I would like to contribute is that there is something missing in these three elements people to identify as the public good or important in democracy. That is the social capital, or the values, or the cultural, or the ethos. I consider that these are the four elements. So I think the key elements that I identify are this. The first one is, and foremost one, is the people, or maybe the public sphere, what we call, or maybe the institutions. Basically, when we talk about institutions, it's all about systems in place, whether the individual having a certain strong support or not, the system which should always be there. And we need to have a civil society, and which always really makes the system work. And finally, the cultural or the social capital, which is very important and the driving force besides these three elements. So I see the people, institutions, here are the systems, and civil society as a collective identity. We can have women, youth, and government workers or civil servants, etc. I see these are very key elements in a democracy, but above all, I do think that cultural or social capital is very, very important.
Thanks for that. That's great. Your research is focused on traditional Gada approaches to governance in Ethiopia and how they might support democratization in that country. Can you explain what Gada governance entails and how it relates to Western models of democracy?
Yes, Gada is a holistic a kind of ancient or maybe very old, long-lived traditional system in East Africa. And you have Gada system in Ethiopia, southern part, and also some parts of northern part of Kenya also. So Gada become form of governance since especially 1424 Gregorian calendar. So it's now almost maybe 600 years since it is really being practiced in this among the Oromo people of the East Africa. So Gada is a holistic. You have a political system, economic, as well as social and cultural. So Gada is not really particularly meant only for political issues. It is holistic. You have economic, when it comes to environment, when it comes to the social relations, when it comes to beliefs. So Gada is a holistic. It's not really mainly meant for political issue, but it has a political element which I would like to, or which I've been dealing with. But it is holistic, and we need in democracy such approach, an approach which is not only meant for legitimacy, or an approach which is meant only for economy, or only meant for a certain collective identity. We need to have a holistic system. So Gada is holistic, and to define Gada, it is difficult. You can approach it in different way, and different people define it differently. There are a number of research on Gada so far, especially professors who are expatriates as well as domestic ones. Each and every one approach from their own disciplines and define Gada from their own perspectives.
And so I understand you've looked at it as a system of governance, and obviously it's more than just perhaps the narrow approach that the Western world takes to governance. Can you tell us a little bit more about how it actually operates in practice?
Yes, considering Gada in a governance system, in a very political system, I see Gada works based on certain building blocks are there, or certain elements. The first is it is an age-based system. So you have age system or age grades. That's the first element. The second one is that you have a generation. You divide into a certain group into generations. You have parties. There are 5 Gada parties at work, and you have the leaders from each 5 Gada classes, or what we call Gada parties. And therefore, this is a unique aspect of Gada political structure. So it's not really the fact that you have a certain idea, or certain you belong to the right or the left or the center. It's not like that. There is a belief that there is a 5 fundamental governments, or natural government they call it. 5 natural governments. These 5 natural governments come to power turn by turn. So it's a kind of cycle. You have it. So in Gada system, you have an age-based as well as generational, and finally you have 5 parties. So considering these elements is very important. And from the very start, what I would like to perceive, or what I would like to you understand, is that it is a quite different knowledge system when it comes to political system, which is far away from the contemporary political system we have in the West. But it does not mean that it is really completely different from the West, but it is a different version of democracy there. And democracy needs to be contextual. And in that context, what I would like to emphasize here is the point that there needs to be the democratic institutions which are established which really peacefully coexist with one another. Certain parties should not really consider as an enemy with one another. That's the kind of system we have, maybe in the West or maybe in Africa, meaning that a certain party is necessarily an enemy for another party. But in a Gada system, these 5 parties are natural and they are believed to be necessary. There is a party of men, which means of reason, and there is a party, they call it a party of sheep, which means tranquility and peace. There needs to be a party which is patriotic, which is maybe at some point feels to be maybe considered to be a right party. Or you have a party which is said to be progressive. They symbolizes party of water. And the other one is party of vulture, resourcefulness, economic prosperity. So considering the Gada parties, which I would like to emphasize in this context because it's also important for the West too, the parties need not to be considering as if they are enemies. They consider as if they are fulfilling their missions, which is said to be considered to be very important for a certain community. Now, how can that really make sense for the West? One thing I would like to emphasize here is that Gada is age-based system, as I've told you earlier on. This age-based system really changes once every 8 years. One party will come to power and will serve the nation for only 8 years. And the next party will come, the next 8 years will be for that party. And then it continues on. So it is very important that it is limited by years of the service that the party should really give to the nation. And the next will come with different approach and different goals than the previous one. But in whole, they are fulfilling within 40 years. You have these 5 parties really served the nations. Do you imagine if the West could have planned such party or predefining party which would really satisfy the interests of the public within 40 years? So that's one cycle. We call it in Gada. One Gada means 40 years. 5 Gada parties served the nation. And again, the first party that served the system will come to power after 40 years. And this is one of the fascinating that I would like to really emphasize in Gada system. The other one is that you have leaders. In Gada system, you don't have really one single leader. For your question, is there a set of order for the 5 parties? Yes, there is a set of orders. Now, they do have names, and the names varies from place to place. We have a Gada system, which is being practiced especially among the Borno of south part of Ethiopia and northern part of Kenya. And they do have orders. Definitely, they do have orders. Who will take power this year, and after 8 years, who will come to power? They do have orders. These orders need not to be really negotiated. This is a cyclical approach. One thing I would like to emphasize concerning beyond parties is that the leaders, you have multi-headed, what others call policephalus, meaning that you will not really mainly focus on one head. You have many heads that really lead a certain party, meaning that you have a president, for instance, in a modern context, you may have a vice president, but you will hail the person individually, or you will make or impeach if he or she do not lead the public or the people in as per the required regulation. That's the main understanding we have about the leaders. But in the context of Gada, you make his or her administration collectively responsible. So this is a fundamentally different one, meaning that the responsibility is not only of the single person, but of his cabinet also, which is very important because the leaders are collectively responsible. They do have 6 fundamentally important heads. One is the president, they do have 2 vice presidents, and they do have 3 councillors. These 6 individuals are very important in Gada system. Every party comes to power, they do have these 6 individuals. And one thing that's surprising about Gada is that after retiring or serving for 8 years, they will not be going to home just as retiring individuals. They will be a member of the parliament or the member of the assembly, because Gada has an assembly. And they will not really once they serve it, they will not go home and rest. That's not the logic behind the Gada system. Instead, they will become counselors in a legislation. They will serve, or they will continue to serve the nation for the next 8 years, because you have that their life is demarcated each and every 8 years, and they continue to serve in the stages that follows. Even if they have served for the last 8 years, they will continue. Imagine if certain leaders of certain country in the West, maybe in Australia or maybe in UK or maybe in US, that the previously key and important leaders, president and the vice president and the councillors, really continue to be a member as in the parliament, if not necessarily as a voting parties or voting individuals, but really as a councillors. So this is a very fundamental thing that is that needs to be learned from Gada, to be precise. I would like to say that this is a fundamentally different perspective, and it would be really very important, not only for Africa, but also maybe for the West. And
how do people get selected to be on the cabinet? Those 6 people, the president and the 2 vice presidents and the councillors, how do they get selected?
That's a really fascinating question, and which is how most people do really ask also. This is not only the fact that you say a good statement that you would be elected. That is really fundamentally different in Gada system. You see that a certain person who has more support from the public and has a fund can really campaign and win an election in the West. This system is not there in Gada system. You will be selected, not elected. You will be selected at the age of 24. This is very astonishing. For me, it is very different, meaning that you will be considered as a potential leader in the future at the age of 24 from your own party. As I've told you that you have 5 parties, your party will nominate you as a potential leader at the age of 24, at the age when they are very young, that they are given responsibility that after maybe 16 years, imagine, after 16 years, they will lead the nation. And knowing this responsibility, they will assume different posts or different positions. So they will be pre-set or pre-informed or pre-selected that they are the one who will lead. Now, the leader, when they reach at the age of 40, nobody would really assume such a serious responsibility before reaching age of 40. So even if, as I've provided in my paper, if you see, that stage is known as Kusa, meaning they are very young, they can be warriors. So their achievement is very important. It is a testing time for them. So they are de facto leaders in the future, and they will have observed 2 parties that will serve ahead of them. At the age of 24, they know that they will be the leaders, and they do have in front of them 2 parties that will lead. Then parties, the third term is theirs. That is how they select. But be reminded that even if the nominated ones are many, you don't nominate only 6 and they stop there. No. The party nominates many and see their performance. When they are approaching, there is a competition. There is a campaign, election campaign, or meaning that to really see that what he has served, what his fathers and forefathers really contributed to that community, they will campaign. And then if the campaign is all right, and if the public really are really convinced with the confirmation of the nomination which had already been happened, then those from among nominated groups, 6 will become really the leaders. So the thing is that it's not a sudden thing that you would campaign and the people would elect. It's not that it's pre-selection. It is not necessarily campaigning at that stage, but campaigning comes in order to have a confirmation that what you have served in the last 16 years is very important. And plus, you have to campaign based on your forefathers' achievements, meaning you have every time that the party come turn by turn, and therefore you have to rely on the accounts or the precedents of the previous forefathers' contribution to that community, and therefore based on that they would be elected. So
the campaigning that you mentioned, when they get to 40, it's their party's turn. Is that campaigning within their party, or is that campaigning across the country?
No, within the party. Within the party.
And how do people come to be in a particular party rather than another? People choose which of the 5 parties they go into, or is that based on where they live or their family? How does that work?
I like to emphasize that these 6 individuals are not only certain group or certain clan. They are from different clans. They have to be representatives. Even if you have one party, the 6 individuals are not only from a single clan. They are from different clans because they need to balance the power of the party. If the party mainly comes from a single clan, that is unfair. That is really not the GADA system is for. Instead of really focusing on the party, what they made is that you have a member who are particularly not only from a single clan or a single group, but from diverse one. And these 6 different members are really balancing the perspective or the idea of one party ruling over all the clans. If I got your question, the party is one, but the members who will lead the party will be from different groups. That is why everybody should have an interest in the party, because it is cross-cutting.
And the party then runs the government. So whichever party is in power has the ability to actually make decisions which are then implemented in the country. Am I getting that right?
Yes, definitely. This is not a country level. Basically, this is a very local context.
Oh, yeah, so this is more of local governance.
Local government.
I noticed in the article that you wrote, you mentioned that there was an issue around women's participation in GADA. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, one of the very critical response to the GADA system is that GADA really doesn't embrace the women in democratic processes. And of course, that is the main limitation of GADA system. I would like to admit that this is the limitation of GADA system. But I would like to also emphasize that there is another system which is alongside of GADA and mainly for married women. In a traditional system, we have what we call it CK. CK is an institution, and it is a term which symbolizes a stick. When a woman marries to a man, she will have a stick. This stick is a symbolic representation of the rights of women. And that means if the husband really abuses her, she will have a right to organize the women to really complain or to really bring the man before law or before the leaders. And this institution is separate from the GADA system. But in a way, it really has a sort of function to protect the rights of women. When it comes to political process, I would like to say that GADA really patriarchal and needs to really consider the gender dimension of the political process. And I have also recommended that GADA really is fundamentally lacking that element. And the good news is that there is a new development which I've observed in last year. There was a power transfer that I observed that in that power transfer, for the first time, women are allowed to really take part in decision making. I have observed in my eyes that women are allowed to really to gather with men under a large tree, which is known as Oda, and they discussed. And then the thing is that they don't have still a voice, which to the extent that's important, but this is a kind of a new opportunity to call for women to really sit and see how the deliberation goes on in terms of taking part in assembly. That's a new development, and the GADA leaders are also considering that. I hope in the future women will be also part of this process. And I think this is not only the problem of GADA system, but of the world, that women are really marginalized, and the GADA also has a responsibility to really embrace women and continue to do so.
It's fascinating to me how that local governance works. I thank you for explaining it to me. How do you see it relates to some of the key elements of Western models that I imagine organisations are trying to get places in Africa to pick up, such as the people decide who's their elected representatives. If they're unhappy with what the elected representatives have done, they can vote them out. What's the equivalent, or if there's no equivalent, if a particular government or a particular party did the wrong thing, what would happen? How would it be dealt with?
You mean in a very modern context or in Gada system?
In Gada system, I'm trying to understand how it relates to Western models of democracy. And I know it's very different, but I'm just trying to tease out different aspects.
You're right. Gada has three elements. Like in the modern democracy, thinking institutionally, you have legislative party or body, you have executive body, and you have judicial body. And there is also fourth element in Gada system, as I've told you, because it's holistic. You have belief or religious element, which is led by the Kalu. Now, leaving the religious aspect beside, let's consider these three elements. There is a checks and the balances in the Gada system too, meaning you have a legislative body known as, among different groups, known as Gumigayo, or a kind of a general multitude assembly, which takes place in the middle of the 8-year term of office. Mm-hmm. The party gather once in 8 years. The Gada General Assembly. This is something you can make it similar with that of the Western representative model of democracy, which is the Congress, or maybe to that of the British Parliament or other Ethiopian or other African countries' parliament. But it is fundamentally different from that. Anybody can take part in Gada General Assembly. Women, any person who has an interest, who has something to say, can really take part in the assembly. Now, coming to impeachment or making a certain leader accountable, the supreme organ, the supreme body is the Gada General Assembly. It's not the executive, it's not the judicial, but basically the General Assembly. This kind of meeting is not necessarily to make laws. It is to make laws and to make kind of legislative decisions, but beyond that, it is to check the performance of the leader within the last 4 years. And in Gada system, if that party, and particularly the leader, have performed in the last 4 years a very good and in a very responsive manner, he will be given the next term to continue and to finish the 8th term office. So there is no second election. There is no investment and taking time and really to waste of time to really elect the same leader in the same campaign, the same investment, the same waste of time. Instead, what they do is that they check at the 4th year, and then if that's all right, he will continue and finish the 8 years. That's how the Gada General Assembly really settles. Imagine if the US or any other political system in the world really they serve 3 years, and in the 4th year, everything is a campaign for re-election. For what? Now, if you consider the Gada system, what they do is that the opposite. No re-election, but checking seriously what he has performed in the last 4 years, and then a kind of permission allowing that to finish the remaining 4 years. There are some experiences that we have in Gada system that where a certain leader is really not responsive, not really achieving what made him elected in the office, but doing the opposite, the Gada General Assembly uproot him. They call it uprooting, or in Oromo language, bukkisu, meaning that you uproot, meaning that you will not really put in the jail, but what you do is that you take the power from the person or decided or giving a decision. That's uprooting. Even if he had the power to decide on the rights or on the claims of others and of natural resources and others, what you do is that you ban him not to really continue to do the same. So that kind of decision has passed, maybe if my mind is correct, in 1724. 1724. It is a long story. He did a very wrong decisions in the passing or affecting the lives of individuals that he supposed to lead in a very well manner. So that kind of experience is there already in Gada system. Who does that? The Gada General Assembly has a responsibility to check the leader in power.
That's really fascinating. It sounds like a system that's been operating for centuries, I gather.
Definitely. And the thing is that Gada was, if you see, recognized by UNESCO recently that this is one of the human innovations as intangible cultural heritage, and has been given a credit. And it is naive, and it is really ironic that while you have such system and still not really being used by Ethiopian government and also maybe by the humanity in general. So it has been sidelined, marginalized, and now given attention, especially from international organizations such as UNESCO, and hopefully this kind of values or elements would really have a place. And this has also something to do with the approach that we define democracy. So democracy, we start from Greek, and anything that's not really away from Greek and away from the West is not really democracy. So that kind of perspective has also an impact on that.
Yes, so that's very interesting. Is there anything else you'd like to explain about the Gada system?
Yes, when it comes to deliberative democracy, now we've talked about structural issues, structural or institutional element that would really be adaptable to the West or maybe to the modern context. Mm-hmm. That's really very important. But when it comes to deliberative democracy, Gada is really consensual system. So it doesn't mean that each and every person would really agree with the statement or with the point at discussion. Has never been and will never be, not 100%. But the thing is that there is a tendency of persuading a person to accept the decision of others. How do they do that? It's not scoring points. That the person speak very well and the others would really accept. Not like that. There is a setting that every person should speak orderly, meaning first person speaks his idea based on the values that he cherish, and others also follows. And by doing so, by sitting in circle, not really in order, in circle, that when the first one speaks, the other one really asks a chance to speak, and if he has a chance, he continues to speak by supporting the previous speaker or else opposing. And the other one also continues, whether supporting or opposing. Through such a long days of discussion, you will have that there is a consensus is a possibility, even if not 100%. Consensus is possibility. So what I would like to focus on in my PhD is that Gada has an approach which is different from the Western setting of deliberative democracy, which is the liberal approach, which is different. And in a sense that they do have a play, they do have values, they do have storytelling, they do have actions also. They do have also listening, not only speaking. And this kind of setting is really very important to be learned from. And so what I would like to add more is that Gada has really potential for the deliberative system, and it's very essential to be underscored that how that come up, because they do have values in place. These values are very important, and every society has a value. And if Gada has a value to be consensual in its approach, so in other cultures also that the values that really can be tapped to use in a deliberative setting.
That's great. Yes, I can see how that links together there. That's wonderful. Thank you for joining me today. The next episode will consider what my guests think is the one change they would like to see in our system of democracy. I ask all my guests the same two questions. What for you is the essence of a real democracy? And if you could change one thing about our current system of democracy, what would it be? Join me next episode to learn what a few of my guests have said in response to that second question. I'd love to hear your answers to both questions and to include your perspectives in future episodes. Send them to me via email to essence@realdemocracynow.com.au. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.